if I were interested in looking at the genetics rooted in Africa, and he was interested in the genetics of diabetes in Africa. And we both got excited, and I'm talking just, it was mind-blowing that the director that I really hadn't really thought about beyond would be interested in exploring opportunities to build a collaboration. So, and again, I think I shared with you his story that he did a medical missions in Nigeria, and at that time, being the MD, Ph.D., he was interested in the clinical presentation of diabetes and treated that and worked with treating the patient, and was struck that these patients had classical type 2 diabetes, but the majority of them, of course, if any, were not obese. And this was in contrast to what he had observed studying the genetics of diabetes in African Americans, where now his research, a PhD side, looking at mechanism and underlying basis for the clinical problem, piqued his curiosity in terms of whether or not looking at type 2 diabetes, clinically definable type 2 diabetes in African patients who were not obese, whether that would provide a resource to tease out the genetics of type 2 diabetes without the confounding and complicating interaction of the genetics of obesity. Okay? So that his interest in, if we were to work together in getting resources from type 2 diabetic patients in Africa, you would have resources for looking at the genomic ancestry of the African American population so that we could look at the genetics of what I'm interested in, the genetics across the board. I'm literally at that point interested in the genome, all the genes, okay? And certainly teasing a project that allows us to try to tease out and find those genes that are associated with type 2 diabetes was of interest that we came together on. We came up with a new opportunity to pursue really what the project is called Africa America Diabetes Mellitus, which we acronym and call ADAM. Now that came out of the brainchild of one of the members of our group, of Dr. Collins' group. Kate Bird was part of the genome. She came up with that idea. Since this is truly a new beginning collaboration between America and Africa with the genome, with genome science. And this is Diabetes Mellitus, the project, and it is between Africa and so unlike previous kinds of definitions at that time, which would have been African American, it really wasn't African American because we were drawing the patients from Africa, okay? And the collaboration then became Africa with America relative to the genome. We worked together, went through a very learning process. Dr. Collins went through establishing a funding base, and how that unfolded was, again, a point in time. NIH was also developing in response to community demands and congressional mandate programs to really, how do we invest in increasing the capacity for research of the NIH level, shall I say, and in this case, of that meets Genome Center standards, and had moved forward with the establishment of this. At this time, it was a center for minority health and health minority health disparities. Okay, the center with John Ruffin. Now, Ruffin trying to do his job at NIH. How am I going to move the science, the research of health disparities forward? So one of his program desires was to partner with directors of other clinical centers or science centers, to partner with him to bring together resources he had for developing research on minority health with directors of heads of scientific centers. Dr. Collins was aware of this and open to this and began dialogue, and dialogue was began between Dr. Ruffin's head of Minority Health Center and Dr. Collins, head of Genome. Okay. Can we link our resources together? Now, Dr. Ruffin also was very conscious of the need to establish research entities on site at minority schools as a necessary step in increasing teaching, training where the people are. The minorities are at the institutions, but the institutions don't have the research infrastructure for the science, okay? For genomic science, I'll be specific, because many of these schools, they exist because they develop whatever talents made them unique and able to survive. Genomic science was not one of those, okay? Because it was just coming to the front in its own rights. But because of that, again, win-win potential, where partnership of Dr. Ruffin with Dr. Collins would result in the capacity to work together to develop genome research capabilities on site in a minority setting, where Dr. Collins was providing support for the science aspect of the infrastructure. I had already established genetics of breast cancer as one area of science to justify as part of a center. We were developing diabetes as another health disparity that we could put under the science umbrella. Dr. Collins also had a young postdoc working with him who was very much involved with doing his postdoc with research mentors at Johns Hopkins on prostate cancer. So when I met this John Carpton is his name, he was interested in the observation had come out that prostate cancer, they were looking for, like we all looking for genes for these complex diseases. Hopkins, he was studying with Hopkins and at the Genome Center. He was kind of like me in being at the Genome Center to use the resources of the center to conduct his prostate cancer work, and he was working under the cancer, Jeff Trent, with the cancer genetics branch, okay. But young black guy, interested in the genetics of a health disparity, And so it was a natural kind of meeting him. And when I met him, it turned out that he had been working with a team of predominantly Black urologists or Black scientists who were interested in prostate cancer in Black men, especially with the higher. Here you got a major health disparity again, high frequency in Black men. Okay, and I'm trying to build capacity for looking at genomics of health disparity. I had breast cancer, so we got the women. Prostate cancer would take care of the men in terms of investing resources, and diabetes, men and women. So again, a triple crown in terms of the science for Dr. Ruffin on health disparities to look at these science projects that aligned with the Genome Center. You see what I'm saying? So we're all happy with the idea. So Dr. Collins worked with his team, his leaders, Jeff Trent, in terms of prostate cancer with John Carpenter, certainly diabetes, his own interest, and breast cancer in terms of the collaboration with Brody. However, the question of how to support and fund the research and the win-win situation was Dr. Ruffin realized and said that his resources could go on the front end in terms of actually supporting the research infrastructure effort, okay? And the research, the science side, would have to go through traditional routes of competitive grant means of peer reviewing the science and assuring that it was frontline capable. So therefore, we talked about a need for genomic science was indeed resources from Africa. At that time, we're also realizing that genome variation through the HapMap Project actually underscored the need for resources from different populations in order to study the science, okay? So Dr. Ruffin could support the idea of building research resources on site to look at the genomics of the health disparities of interest. But we needed funding to do the science. So let's use the route that NIH traditionally has in place for getting resources that intramural programs need but don't have access to in their existing extramural programs. Okay, already part of how do we look at the timing for this? So we work together on a contract that would have the specific requirement of deliverables for doing the science that we get the resources for. So Dr. Collins brought in the experts at NIH to put together a review team for developing a contract that will meet NIH's needs, So we were successful in developing the contract. In this case would be a request for RFP, request for proposals, as distinguished from the RFA, but for proposals to provide the genomic resources needed to do the scientific. Okay. We need to get these resources from Africa. Okay, so how do we do that? Again, you look at what's already in place. So we looked at scientists who were already doing work on site in Africa, collecting materials, working with scientists there. And this came under the big umbrella of epidemiology, studying disease in populations. So at that time, I was made aware of Dr. Charles Rotimi, who at the time was finishing one of the premier NIH research training, a research award, NIH Career Development Research Award, but the major top of the line research award. And he had moved, or was at Loyola, working with his advisor there, and studying hypertension, okay, in Africans, okay. As a native-born Nigerian, he had an early interest in wanting to apply his skills and techniques to looking at disease in populations of interest that he experienced, his family, people. So anyway, that Dr. Collins was very instrumental in actually looking at how we might be able to develop a proposal, a competitive proposal for collecting samples from type 2 diabetics in Africa. We focused on the area where Dr. Rotimi already had a team of scientists, clinical scientists on board, working with him in hypertension, okay? He was willing to lead this AADM project for collecting samples, but it has to be, again, win-win, okay? Bottom line is, it's just suffice it to say, I was successful in recruiting him to the newly formed Genome Center to be director of a new genetic epidemiology program, where he would have the opportunity to not only lead, but actually form a research entity right aligned with his own interests, independent of this. Working with Dr. Carpton and the clinical team that he had already started working with prostate, we also developed a contract for recruiting African American men, which was also a needed resource that the Genome Institute did not have in its resources. And so we put out an RFP for the African American Hereditary Prostate Cancer Network. And that network had then, and probably still true, the charge, because it too was a cooperative contract, where we clearly working with the institute, working with NIH and our institute and our scientists to deliver on the resources needed. Just really exciting, because our requirement was to recruit 100 families that met the most stringent criteria for eligibility, because this was a pedigree analysis study. So we needed enough people in the family to utilize the design for a pedigree study to even qualify for this project. A family, so we're dealing with a family unit, had to have 4 diagnosed prostate cancer men, doctor diagnosed, and we would have to be able to get samples from at least 3 of those, okay? just to qualify for this study. And because it was a family, we needed families that consisted of a minimum of 8 people, because you need people in the family, or particularly the men, you need people that don't have the disease, as well as those that have, to look, to try to probe for the underlying differences. Really exciting. Suffice it to say, we were successful. I remember the time when we went to the 103 families, okay? But we collected those samples and have worked collaboratively with the scientists engaged in that project. And even now, just recently, we were talking about applying whole genome sequencing into samples, because we were all working at the technology at that time. That the first focus was identifying genes, and that's where we came in. My interest has always been variation in the gene once it's found, and that's where the molecular genetics program in the Genome Center, where I was able to recruit with Dr. Collins, again, help Rick Kittles, who headed the molecular genetics program, okay? And just to round out the Genome Center, so we recruited George Bonney was already there because he had history with Howard University through his research centers in the minorities, where he had been recruited to serve as the head of biostatistics, okay? Now, with the promise of a Genome Center, we were able to attract him from Fox Chase. I say, George, now's the time to come back, bring that skill. We're going to have a center here, because having a center at Howard was part of his heart's desire when he first came to Howard. He was the one who actually told me, Georgia, what you're doing in HLA polymorphism is exactly what the Genome Project is about for the whole genome. I'm looking at polymorphisms that are associated with disease. And it turns out, because I'm studying the HLA region, which has many genes involved in the immune response, so genes involved in immune regulation, which can be related to a whole category of disease, many of which are what we call autoimmune. And there were differences in the autoimmune diseases. For example, type 1 diabetes here. I was already doing research with investigators at Howard on type 1 diabetes, because it was known to be HLA associated, okay, already. And so the whole capacity to bring this together. But George said to me, Georgia, what you're doing with HLA and Disease Association, I serve on the advisory for the Genome Center, and this is exactly what is envisioned for the Genome Project, using variation, polymorphisms in the genome to map for genes, to find genes. And it will follow. With every gene identified, your world opens up, because we need to then ask, what is the variation in the gene? And if that variation is associated with distribution or frequency in the population. It came together through the resources coming from different pathways at that time. A major pathway was what was already in place that was responsible for me being able to set up the Human Immunogenetics Lab, which looked at HLA. And that resource came through research centers in minority institutions, RCMI, which was already a program given NIH the funds to build research centers in minority institutions. RCMI, it came under the NCRR at the time, the National Center for Research Resources. They put out applications for RCMI. Howard responded. One of the components of Howard's response was the application that I wrote for a genetics laboratory to do HLA. I was using the testing at that time, which was primarily serological, okay? Because again, look at this. The resources for doing the testing came primarily from white women, okay? Because pregnancy and the production of HLA is a kind of common occurrence with having children where the child inherits HLA from the father. That's different from the mother. And she produces antibodies just as part of the normal immune response. Anyway, but we had a situation where we didn't have resources from Black women. So I was able to partner with my colleague at Georgetown, who was already doing HLA studies, to get a major contract to collect. This was an NIAID. They were supporting collecting resources for HLA testing, to refine HLA testing. And that was a big contracting partnership with Georgetown. But again, the opportunity to apply funding to get the resources that you need to do the science at the level that the field was advancing has been an open door in terms of how we grow. But I had the RCMI lab, which became, with the genome, Dr. Bonney said, you got what we need to apply for a center here. And so that was certainly the basis for making a case for a genome testing laboratory at Howard. It really was a direct extension of the immunogenetics HLA testing that I was doing and had gotten through our transplant surgeon, had gotten certification to do clinical testing, because it's the same antigens you're looking at. And we were sending our samples. We had a transplant center, but we were sending our samples out to another lab to do the testing. So with me collecting resources and also fast forward, so we were able to add clinical histocompatibility testing. And we had a certified clear clinical laboratory certification to do the clinical testing. So together with the HLA testing laboratory, with support for the genetics of health disparities, that funding from RCMI was first in terms of a laboratory there looking at genetics, and then the contracts for diabetes, AADM, and the contract for prostate cancer, which we call the AAHPC, were like foundation science to justify the center. Dr. Ruffin's then put major funding from his mandate to establish research centers on minority health. Okay. Well, I didn't say he didn't have a mandate to establish a center, but actually to have the research on minority health disparities done. Okay. So that was aligned with his mandated funding. Dr. Collins on the genome was able to put in funding under his mandate for the genomics of the diseases, and then also specific areas that came under also his program, in this case, cancer. Okay, so cancer justified investment through the Genome Center. Health disparities justified investments through the Health Disparities Center, and research At minority, justified support through NCRR. But all of them had to come together for the center. I was so delighted. We had the celebration and the acknowledgement of the center literally was May 1st, 2001. And at that time, I had Dr. Ruffin, Dr. Collins, okay, and of course, my core leaders that had been recruited, the head of 4 programs. I've already mentioned Dr. Rotimi, Dr. Bonney, who was there with it, okay, Dr. Kittles, who was recruited to head the molecular genetic, and a young West Indian who had come from Howard to do a postdoc in the ELSI component of the Genome Center, the ethical, legal, social implications. She had a heart for the sickle cell patients and how they responded to their disease that's genetic. We had our core leaders and all of the NIH components that support celebrated the establishment of the National Human Genome Center at Howard University. That was key to us, at Howard University, not the Howard University Genome Center, but the National Human Genome Center at Howard University, which also left opportunities for other centers to be formed through NIH support at other places. When I came, it was the National Center for Human Genome Research. It was also the National Center for health disparities, okay? I have been a part of the history of both, in terms of time, of both of these entities moving from an office in the director of NIH to then becoming a center. And it was at this time when we were envisioning the National Human Genome Center that actually Francis Collins had been called to the White House at that time when he was for the announcement of the National Institute. So he moved from the end. And literally he was coming back from that and made a stop at Howard, okay? And the idea, well, Francis, since you are now the National Institute, our center can be the National Center. I mean, that was at the time, and that was true. But then the implications of the significance of this went beyond just the fact that there was a vacancy at the moment for a national center, human genome, with the whole history of bringing at least the African American population into the mainstream of the science enterprise and in the mainstream of America. Oftentimes, out of segregation, during the segregation era, the development in the African American community led to a national association, since they were not made part of the American Association. And this is reflected in medicine, where the initial, with majority population, is the American Association Medical Colleges, AAMC, the American Association. So likewise was the law. It was the American law, what have you. So that American tag was a natural for these professional organizations in the mainstream. But as Black grew in the professions and were made products, counterparts often carried the national tag. So we have the National Association, a medical association. We have the National bar exam. We have National Association even for the Advancement, NAACP. So this national tag was often used to distinguish the mainstream existing organizations that was in a segregated community. So the idea that the center, the Genome Center at Howard, is in line for it to, especially how it came into being through the collaboration and partnership with the National Institutes of Health. NIH obviously recognized the need to engage minority scientists, but the structure, the institutionalized structure, is one that puts priority on bringing the scientists here to do the research. That's factored into the training, the fellowships, and like most situations, once you come to NIH and you get adjusted, shall I say, to the resources that make the research available. Okay? This was the challenge. This has always been the challenge way back to when I got my postdoc and I came to the National Cancer Institute. You come to NIH, which is like heaven in terms of resources. Your grant, in this case, your fellowship, your postdoc, ends. And part of the understanding was that you would then bring that expertise back. Genomic research in general as an enterprise, requires an infrastructure. No one does successful research as a lone scientist sitting in a lab. The institution itself has to provide the necessary support to be able to even manage a grant if you're successful. So my point is, the answer to your question about other schools applying, all of the things that were part of the history that I went through with you would have to be clearly some way replicated. And that has not necessarily been the history. And many of those schools were attempting to get resources to train, which brought their scientists to NIH. And once you come to NIH, you want to stay at NIH. Okay? Certainly, if you want to continue your science, going back to a school that has no infrastructure. Okay? Remember, one of the things that Howard offered was they had been one of the first recipients of the research centers in minority institutions. That program has since mushroomed. But I love this about genomics, we must appreciate and recognize the uniqueness of each institution as a unit, okay, as a life. The fact that it exists, it has something that it needs to recognize and build on. It so happened that because of Georgia Dunston, who had the history I had an interest in genomics or genetics at that point that goes back to my childhood. So Howard developed Genome Center as an aspect of their research center because of who's there. And so you would need someone with that scientific interest at the site. And the other sites are rich with scientists with their own historical things that lead to the science they're doing. Okay? And so to answer your question, to my knowledge, there is no other freestanding center. And certainly I'm not aware of one that's called itself a National Center for Human Genome, a National Human Genome Center at Meharry, at any other minorities. I'm not aware of any others. Certainly, we have many scientists at those sites that are doing state-of-the-art, first-class, highly competitive genome science, okay? But they're doing it more out of the development of their scientific interests and collaborating with the folk in the area, bringing their part to that science, but not necessarily as a defining part of that institution. So now we have very competitive, productive, well-trained scientists heading these areas, like the names I mentioned to you, like a George Bonney, who could recruit a postdoc from France with the Center for the Study with Seth, okay? She was from Seth, and he recruited. You have a Charles Rotimi, who has an established base, who's able to establish collaborations based on the science. And he's able to work in ways. He brings what he can to the science. He brings his expertise now of the science to the resources. Okay, so you see his career blossom and meeting all the checkoffs for this path in terms of publications in mainline, invitations to conferences, recognition as a leader in this area, all that goes with this arena, being able to even get a position at the NIH to advance his base to include world health or global health, as you will, okay? And his success and his productivity is a matter of record. So is with George Bonney. He was really already established as a statistician, genetic statistician, having worked with Elston's group in Louisiana before he came to Howard. So, like I said, but because of his stature, he was serving on the board, on the advisory board for the genome. He was able to recruit a postdoc. He had come from a chair position of biostatistics at Fox Chase. So he was established, and he came with an R01. One of his bargaining chips was he had an R01 as part of what he was bringing to accept. And as a consequence of that, he was able to negotiate with the university. I can bring 2 people on my grant. I need you to support 2 other people to help me form my unit. You see what I'm saying? So every step has things that are part of how the system develops. So he was leading that. Rick Kittles was just out of his Ph.D. He was in line for major postdoc position, but he had a heart for the ancestry part, the genetics of African people in his science. So we were able to recruit him to head that molecular genetics because I was really most involved with the overall as the founding director of the whole thing. So he was my co-director for molecular, and I had to start with trying to even get him a tenured position. ELSI was a small percent. I think they say 5% of the $1 billion budget for the genome project, but it was there. Credit is often given to the fact that human genome thinkers were concerned at the outset about the potential impact of the knowledge that would come from sequencing the genome and identifying it, particularly as it related to ethical, legal, social implications, which are the main front of issues today. Okay, main front. We called our unit Gen Ethics as a hybrid of genomics and ethics. And Charmane Royal was just out of her postdoc when but she was the only one that met all the criteria for leading this group. And bless her heart, she came and she started just as the principal investigator, but worked very hard with her people to get grants that address the thing you mentioned, engagement of the community, education of the community. In fact, she played a major role in the engagement of African populations in the HapMap Project. She and Dr. Rotimi were major persons from the Genome Center that really drove the engagement of Africans into the HapMap Project, the first round. Charles, I really single-handedly, I would say, with his team on the ground in terms of getting that first round of Africans, which were part of the area that he had been working with, the Yoruba. But like everything, as things move forward, as no sooner than you get Yoruba as part of your reference resource, everybody's saying, but they're not representative of the whole. So you have the whole push to increase the populations and then the different people with that. But suffice it, you had to have a starting point. Charles was first in recruiting, using his team on the ground to recruit from the Yoruba to meet the criteria of a genome-based resource, which we remain, which is will always, there's no repeating. There was never more than, there's only one first, okay? We do build and we grow from there. Charmane worked with Charles and worked closely with the international team dealing with the ethical issues in recruiting Africans. Very excited to be director, but I was director because of the role that I played in bringing it into being. So I chose and recognized that I was founding director in bringing it into being. People at the university recognized the history and the role that I had had. So I think that made it difficult to have in decision making. We already have Georgia here, okay? So there were two sides of looking at recruiting for a director that reflected people that were of my group and of my group. You know, Georgia's here. She's doing the job. She wants to do the job and what have you. However, she lacks what the mainstream puts as their measure of eligibility, which is that search and recruiting someone and what you get in bargaining. When you bring someone in, you get someone to look at what the university is offering, what you can bring, and what will be your contribution. You lose that when you deal with someone who's already there, okay? So on the one side, it can be a loss to the next step of growth, which clearly there were many on that side. At the same time, the university is always dealing with its budget. And that's really the excuse, I'll say, that was given to not pursuing, was that in making budgetary decisions, a package for a competitive director position was not considered as crucial from the institution point of view as some other needs of directors. NIH sees the investment in a director as part of the institutional's demonstration of its commitment. And I went through cycles where you come for review and the institution, your science, your people you got, the science is good, but where's the institutional commitment for us to put in our commitment? And I've seen that effect how things grow and operate at that level. So I'm hopeful that because of the very place of genomics, not only in medicine but in society, I mean, genomics has taken over everything that has to do with who we are, why we are, what we are, okay? So the very place of genomics hopefully will be itself an incentive for investment in this science, especially given the roots.